Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Cycling and Walking. I'm Selaine Saxby. I'm the co-chair of the APPG, along with Ruth Cadbury, who will be joining us later. This morning's session, there's still people arriving. Thank you. It is, we have over 500 people registered, which is a first. So thank you. It's obviously a very popular topic. And while saying thank you, I'd like to thank Landor Links Live for hosting us today and City Science for all the work that has gone in to today's fantastic presentations. So getting to net zero is something that I'm personally very passionate about, and obviously as a government we are committed to, and cycling and walking are obviously an integral part of this. And so today we'll be looking at some of the topics tackled within the gear change plan released in July 2020, and how do we make our streets more appropriate for cycling and walking and ensure that the decisions that are taken around them are actually right. My own constituency is very rural, and so I often see the world a bit differently to a lot of the city-based plans for walking and cycling. So I'm particularly interested today to hear about e-bikes, which is quite hilly for those of you who have been to North Devon here, and also how we can actually be looking at cycling for everyone, because again, I have an older population up here. So it's a fascinating series of presentations for me. Please do feel free to submit questions, but please can you keep them brief in the question box, because there's a lot of people on the call and we're very keen to be able to ask those questions for you, but if they could be succinct, it would be much appreciated from a technological point of view in the background. So that's what I'd like to say. I'd like to now take this opportunity to welcome the speakers this morning. We have Dr. Ian Phillips, who's the Senior Research Fellow from the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. I'm not going to say it right, I'm sorry, Dr. Llinos Brown, the Research Fellow at the Institute for Transport Studies, Susan Claris, who is the Transport Planner at Arup, and Laurence, the Chief Exec from City Science, and Ruth will be joining at the end to sum up. So I very much hope that you will enjoy the webinar, and I am going to hand over to Dr. Ian Phillips. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. So my name's Ian Phillips. I work at the Institute for Transport Studies. Most of my research is about using spatial data, making maps that help us to understand transport and decarbonisation. Today I'm going to talk about e-bikes, their capability to contribute to net zero and where they can help out the most. So I'll tell you about a piece of research I've done. I've been using health survey data to estimate how far people are physically capable of travelling by e-bike each day. I've linked this information to how far people drive in their cars to get estimates of how much car use people are capable of replacing with an e-bike. From this, I've estimated the maximum possible CO2 reductions, and the aim is to help policymakers who are designing visions and pathways to net zero to understand the upper limit on how much e-bikes could contribute. Next slide, please. So the absolute maximum upper threshold on CO2 reduction with e-bikes is about 30 million tonnes a year in England, which is about half of the car CO2 emissions. That's if every mile of car travel that you're physically capable of replacing gets moved from car to e-bike, and that's summed across the whole population. So it's a useful figure because it tells us that e-bikes could be strategically important, so supporting e-bike uptake would be worthwhile. I suppose we should also be honest and say 50% is still only half, so I wouldn't want to oversell any single technology as being a panacea. But I do think e-bikes are part of the solution. If we look at the per person figures, then the greatest capability to reduce carbon is for people who live in rural areas and areas outside of major cities. We also found that there are a number of places where communities are vulnerable to the costs of car dependence, but they also have a high e-bike carbon reduction capability. And here, e-bikes might aid both carbon reduction and social inclusion. Next slide, please. So the greatest opportunities for carbon reduction are for residents of rural and suburban areas. There are rural areas where people on average are capable of 5 times the carbon reduction of a city centre resident. For example, the map shows that in parts of major city centres, savings are on average around 200 kilograms per person, but the maximum possible savings are around 1,000 kilograms per person in some rural areas. There's a lot of variation within areas as well as between them. Not everyone in every community could make use of an e-bike, but in many rural and suburban communities, there's many people who are capable of replacing over 5,000 kilometres of car use every year. Of course, the pathway would have to remove the barriers to realising that capability. So as an example of this, in Denmark, they're already building quality cycle infrastructure to link rural areas to urban areas. In a pathway to net zero, then initially you might want to target a few places with e-bike promotion and a package of measures to remove barriers, for example, through some kind of e-bike demonstrator scheme and a place-based approach. It makes sense to target rural and suburban areas for this, which have got the capability to deliver large CO2 reduction per pound spent. Next slide, please. So the capability for e-bike carbon savings are greatest outside major cities. We know that particularly in cities, most trips are short. We know that walking and conventional cycling are great for replacing short car trips. The graph shows the bottom bar where that 65% of car trips in England are under 5 miles. However, it also shows that these short trips only account for about 18% of CO2 emissions. And we see in the bar above that trips of 5 to 35 miles long account for a much bigger proportion of car CO2. Within this block, e-bikes have the capability to replace a lot of car trips, particularly those between 5 and 15 miles long, and a few that are a bit longer than that too. And this is where e-bikes are strategically very helpful. A lot of trips of this length happen in car-dependent places, like rural areas and suburbs. E-bikes offer a non-car alternative here where there aren't currently many other solutions available. Next slide, please. We should also consider the social impacts of decarbonisation. The Transport Decarbonisation Plan and Gear Up both mention this. I contributed to another piece of work where we examined vulnerability to car dependence in terms of car costs, overall income, and public transport accessibility. On this map, dark green shows where high vulnerability and high capability for CO2 reduction with e-bikes intersect. In these places, targeted support for e-bike use could help economically vulnerable communities as part of a green recovery from COVID. The yellow on the map is where there is low vulnerability and high carbon reduction capability. So this area is also useful because it's showing us where people don't necessarily need to drive as much as they do. So we might want to consider different policies here. Next slide, please. So today I've told you that maximum capability to reduce transport CO2 using e-bikes is quite substantial. We know that the climate science and the urgent need to act is with us. We also know that there's a big gap between pre-COVID trends in behaviour change and what's necessary to reach net zero. Most transport analysis predicts what people are likely to do based on past behaviour in normal pre-COVID times. So some people might say it's unrealistic to think about replacing half our car travel with e-bike use. But the thing is, in lockdown 1, we halved our car use overnight because we had to. The participants in the Climate Assembly earlier this year found that there will need to be some hard choices in order for our transport use to change and to get us to net zero. So I think it is helpful to show you as policymakers all of the possibilities, all of the capabilities, and what you could do if you had to. And this piece of research is a tool for policymakers who've got a vision for net zero. I've told you that there are a large number of people in a variety of places who could halve their car CO2 emissions by using an e-bike instead. The research I've shown you indicates where you might find people who could decarbonise with an e-bike. And so in this analysis, I hope it helps you to design policies which take you where you want to go. Thanks very much. If you flip to the final slide, there's just some contact details and further information.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phillips. That was great. We're going to take all of the questions at the end, so please do pop them into the question bar and keep them brief if you possibly can. And we're now going to be, I think I need to say, next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. So now going to be handing over to Dr. Llinos Brown, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Transport Studies and talking about travel and social adaptation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Selaine. Let me start by introducing myself. My name's Llinos Brown, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Transport Studies, also at the University of Leeds. And today I'm going to talk about some research that I'm currently involved in, working with Professor Greg Marsden, Professor Gillian Annabelle, and Professor Ian Doherty, which looks at transport, travel, and social adaptation during the COVID crisis, and how this has changed and how this changes over time, and whether there are any regional differences across England and Scotland. In the previous presentation, Ian's just spoke about e-bikes and their capability and potential for change, and I'm going to move the conversation on to talk about the barriers and ability to change, focusing on cycling and what we've seen during the pandemic, and begin to provide some suggestions on the pathways to societal change to achieve net zero. I'll go into the data we collected at the end, time permitting, but this presentation is going to draw on findings from the first round of 9,500 surveys and 100 interviews which took place in June and July, and the second and 2 rounds of policy and expert interviews which took place in June and October. Next slide, please. So this graph highlights the 10 different regions where our surveys were conducted, and that's on the bar on the left, and it shows the percentage changed in the use of each transport mode. And there is a lot of information on this graph, and I apologise for that, but I wanted to draw your attention to the right hand side of it, where you can see the green bars which represent walking and the purple bars which represent cycling. And this graph shows that on average walking and cycling rates increased across the majority of locations where we conducted our survey. And I'm sure the results regarding decrease in public transport use and car use won't come as a surprise to anybody. But what this graph shows is that society does have the capacity and capability to change when required. But what can we learn from this? What do people have to say about walking and cycling during the pandemic, and how can this help us move towards a net zero society? Next slide, please. So we can see that cycling was largely for leisure purposes during the lockdown, well, the first lockdown, and not for commuting or other journeys. And I'll come back to talking about commuting in a moment. The quieter roads have provided a great opportunity for many people to get out and gain more confidence on the roads, and particularly and provide a much safer space to learn how to navigate the roads as a cyclist. But we did find that in our interviews, which took place in July, that some people had already started adapting their cycle routes because they'd seen an increase in traffic. So this demonstrates that safety on the roads is still a big concern and a barrier to cycling. And this was a point that was raised by a number of people in the interviews as well. In terms of people that have bikes and people that have purchased bikes, we can see from our surveys that there were a number of people that purchased bikes during the lockdown. So the graph on the right-hand side shows in the blue bars the percentage of our sample that had access to a bike, and the orange bars represent the people that had acquired a bike during the lockdown. And from the interviews, we can see that people told us that they struggled to get hold of bikes during the lockdown. and often resorted to buying second-hand bikes, which is great for sustainability, but it does then pose some questions about how suitable are these bikes in terms of the type of bike, the size of the bike, the condition of the bike, and how do these new owners of bikes get information about the various equipment that can make their cycling experience safer and a lot more enjoyable, such as mudguards and lights. So it'll be interesting to see in our next round of interviews whether people have continued using their bikes and if not, begin to explore reasons why. The bike hire schemes have been great, and a number of our interviewees had mentioned that they don't normally cycle and they wouldn't class themselves as a cyclist, but they've used the bike hire schemes. So they're great for people that have maybe got limited space, maybe concerned about security of bikes or can't afford a bike. So it demonstrates that by providing these facilities, it does encourage the uptake of cycling. In terms of e-bikes, we didn't ask directly about e-bikes in our interviews. We asked people about cycling, but a number of people did mention e-bikes, and a number of people in Glasgow mentioned e-bikes. And we kind of had a look into this, and we think that's to do with there's a bike hire scheme in Glasgow that includes e-bikes in their fleet. But putting that to one side, it's clear from the comments that we got from our interviews regarding e-bikes that there's a general lack of knowledge about their range, price, and potential to assist with journeys. So moving on to commuting, there is an intention, a want, and a desire to commute by bike, but this is a big ask for a lot of people. The commute is quite a complex journey and can often involve a lot of other activities such as shopping or taxiing around children for after-school activities. And when we start to talk about commuting by bike, fitness levels and fatigue at work is a concern for the people that we interviewed. Some people had tried cycling to work, but this, along with being on your feet all day, started to impact their kind of days off. So they actually resorted back to using their old ways of commuting. And continuing this, there's a compatibility issue with bikes and public transport. People commented on the need for a more integrated transport network inclusive of bike travel to provide an option to split up the commute, kind of build up to kind of cycling all the way to work, because you currently can't take bikes on bus, tubes or trams, and it's often difficult to get a bike on the train at pre-COVID peak times. So a more integrated network approach inclusive of bike travel would be helpful. Next slide, please. So moving on to talk about some of the findings from our policy and expert interviews. The expectations of pop-up infrastructure were very high, and there was a lot of talk in the media and talk about the level of investment and money available for emergency infrastructures. But the quantity of a lot of this infrastructure to date has been relatively small, and the areas which had plans already in place have done a better job at delivering and achieving quality schemes. And it's important to think about how we can evaluate infrastructure developments. And this isn't just a conversation to have for COVID pop-up infrastructure. This is a wider conversation about cycling counters and how we kind of measure active travel. Currently, a lot of the travel counters are in locations where we expected to see high footfall pre-COVID, but they might not be the same locations as where people are walking and cycling now. So do we need to invest more for better evaluation in the future? But what does all this mean for cycling and walking post-COVID? We've seen during COVID that if you take the barriers away, people will walk and cycle more. And whether these levels continue or not, COVID has shown we are capable of the changes we need to meet net zero emissions. But now the conversation needs to move on to how we might embed some of these behaviours into day-to-day activities. Infrastructure developments need to be linked to localised agendas, which show great potential for active travel. For example, with policies around 20-minute neighbourhoods. And in the data that we've collected, we can see regional differences are happening. And a more place-based decarbonisation agenda might be a way to embed active travel modes more effectively. And a way to think about the recent investments is maybe to see them as the end of the beginning. And now is the time to move the message away from one that's been about investment, the money available and money spent, to a message about necessity, about health, and about long-term goals and the benefits of active travel. Next slide, please. And just to finish, I wanted to kind of highlight that we're going to continue to look at all of these themes that I've mentioned today in more detail over the next few months. This research that I'm involved in is a longitudinal study, and the bit in red here highlights our future data collection schedule. So we'll be able to see whether behaviours stick and continue over time, whether the intentions translate into behaviours, and look at where the regional differences are taking place. Next slide, please. So this is just contact details, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, that was fascinating. And so if I can do a next slide, please. There we go. If you have got questions, please do pop them in the question bar. We'll be doing them all at the end, and the presenters have kept these presentations nice and snappy, so there should be plenty of time to ask questions. I'm now going to hand over to Susan Claris, who is a transport planner with Arup. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be here today talking in this event about investing in cycling and walking. And my focus is that if we are investing in cycling and walking to achieve net zero, it really must be for everyone. So if we can go to the first slide, please. And I illustrate this with this image. I love this image. I took this on one of my morning walks, and for me this summarizes or symbolizes how cycling should be. So I'm a transport planner at Arup, and I'm also vice president and a trustee of Living Streets, the UK charity for everyday walking. And we've had a particular focus on inclusion because cycling, as I'm sure most people on the call are aware, does tend to be dominated by a certain demographic. So that really is having that focus on it being for everyone. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Be talking today about the barriers that people face in terms of cycling. We've already heard about some of those, and then in particular the actions that can be taken to improve those. And this is drawing on work that we at Arup did with Sustrans over the last 2 years, which involved doing a literature review, which involved looking at Sustrans bike life data, which involved surveys with 16,000 people in 12 cities. We've held focus groups, we've held workshops, and we've developed a database of case studies. And the picture there, if people can see the text at the bottom, it was Dame Olivia de Havilland, the actress, taken unfortunately shortly before she died, but there she is, aged 104, on a tricycle, looking glamorous, and I think that's just a wonderful image for cycling. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Our report on cycling for everyone with Sustrans, which by a stroke of massive good fortune came out on the same day as the government's gear change document. I'd like to say we planned it that way, but we didn't. We set the date for publication back in March, so it was just one of those happy coincidences in life. And in that report, we focused on 5 underrepresented groups in cycling, which is women. 76% of women never cycle. Older people, which we use the definition of people over the age of 65, and over 85% of people in that category never cycle. People from ethnic minority groups, disabled people, and people at risk of deprivation. And again, for those last 3 groups, about 75% of people in those groups never cycle. So if we move to the next slide, please. First thing we looked at in barriers is in terms of places. And I think this is well summarised by a quote from Isabel Clement that says, "We are focused on one type of cyclist and baked in long-standing barriers for disabled people." So one of the key concerns, and we heard about this from Llinos, is road safety concerns, perceived or actual, and that is a major reason why people don't cycle. That the cycling infrastructure is not inclusive because it has been designed for a certain type of cyclist. That cycling infrastructure, it doesn't reach all areas, and it certainly doesn't cater for all journeys. We've tended to have a focus on commuting journeys for a particular type of cyclist, not looking so much at local journeys. There's a lack of public cycle share provision. Again, just heard how important that is from Llinos, particularly where including electric and adapted cycles. Some real concerns around personal safety and security, and also that when cycling facilities are provided, they're not fully integrated with people's homes, with their destinations, and with public transport. So some real barriers in terms of places. And if we move to the next slide, which looks at the barriers for people, And I think it's this whole image of what cycling is and what a cyclist is, and you only have to do a Google search on the word cyclist and you see very strongly the images that come up, or look in the press whenever you have a press story about cycling. It's typically a white male sporty or commuting image, and people don't associate that with themselves. So people don't associate cycling for people like them. There are issues to do with accessibility or ownership of a cycle. If you don't have access or own a cycle, you're not going to cycle. Barriers around people's ability and particularly their confidence in terms of cycling, and also around the fear of harassment. And then if we go to the next slide, the barriers in terms of governance, there's a lack of representation in decision making. The engagement with the public is not representative, and if you have something around cycling, then if people don't associate cycling for them, they're not going to participate in that. That transport policy often ignores the need aspect. The cycling infrastructure standards are not fully inclusive, and there is a lack of representation in marketing. And the photo bottom right there is one of my intense dislikes, when you end up with a particular demographic in a panel that is not representative, and unfortunately we see that all too often in transport. So those are the barriers. So what can we do to improve it? So if you move to the next slide, please, and I'll look at these under the same categories. So 3 key recommendations. The first one is that we need to improve governance, planning and decision making. And what we should be doing is we should be designing walking and cycling strategies with plans to address how they reduce inequity, and we should evaluate them against that. In the past, cycle planning has often focused on recreation or on health or on physical reasons. It hasn't been targeted to areas that are suffering from poor health. Also, there's been a focus on the larger cities, as Selaine mentioned at the beginning, not looking at the smaller areas, at smaller towns, at cities and at rural areas. So we need to target these. We need to increase diversity and representation in decision making in the transport sector. Just on the aspect of gender, the transport sector is 80% male. There is a tendency that people design in their own image, so it needs to be more inclusive. And we certainly need to improve decision making through better evidence and public engagement. You know, this is not just a numbers game. We've sort of moved on from, well, I think cycling and walking being largely ignored. We've gone past that. Then there was a focus on sort of having outputs in terms of, you know, putting in 2 kilometers of cycle lane, boxes ticked. Now we need to focus more on outcomes, and it isn't just counting the numbers of people, it's looking at who those people are and crucially who those people aren't. So if we move on to the next slide, please, about creating better places. This is particularly around road safety, as we heard from Llinos, and it's the fact that actually recognising that risk is not shared. Women have more near misses than men. The consequences of collisions are far greater for older people, and also many disadvantaged areas have increased traffic risks. So improving road safety is really important with protected space by creating low traffic neighbourhoods. We need to address personal safety and harassment, because that can be a real barrier for people, and it's about creating choice, and obviously it's about eradicating that harassment as well. That's the most important thing to do, but also it's about making sure people have a choice of routes. And it's about ensuring that the walking and cycling infrastructure is fully inclusive. And so then the third slide, please, next slide, please, rather, the third one is about welcoming and giving support to all people to walk and to cycle. So it is about using inclusive language and imagery. And I always try and talk about cycling and not about bikes, because a bike has a certain image of it. Cycling or talking about cycles includes tricycles, adapted cycles, cargo cycles. It's a more inclusive word. So I said it really makes sure that walking and cycling should be welcoming and should celebrate diversity. And the graph on the right shows that for the different groups, the 5 different groups we looked at, whether people associated cycling as an activity for people like them, and then if they don't cycle, would they like to start? And you can see that for older people at the bottom there in the dark blue, nearly 1/3 of older people did not associate cycling as an activity for people like them. And I was on a call with a counsellor earlier this week and talking about cycling, and he was saying, yeah, but what happens when you're 60? You know, it's just seen that it isn't something that older people do, but that is very much not the case, and e-bikes can be a really important part of that. And then in terms of the people who don't cycle but would like to start, you can see that the top row there, the ethnic minority groups, a massive amount of unmet demand. 55% of people said they don't cycle but they would like to start, but they need help to do that. So we need to ensure that cost is not a barrier to access a cycle, particularly for people that need an adaptive cycle. And it's about having cycle training for all levels, for children and for adults. So if you move to the final slide, please. What we want to do now is move on, and actually we're focused on cycling, and many of those issues apply to walking as well. And in terms of the way we look at transport, we nearly always have this pyramid that puts walking at the top in its broader sense, and walking is part of every journey. It is the ultimate form of zero emission transport. So we're really pleased to be building on this work that we've done on cycling for everyone and develop it into walking everyone, and in discussion with Living Streets and Sustrans at the moment in terms of how we can take these recommendations, build on them, look at the particular issues that are barriers for walking and how to help that. And we hope that that will be coming out next year. So walking very much on the agenda as well as cycling. So thank you very much indeed.
And thank you, Susan. Delighted to hear more about walking coming through, as I think that's certainly more accessible out here for a number of my personal constituents. And so the final presentation today is from Laurence Oakes-Ash, who is the CEO at City Science. Handing over.
Right, well, it's just turned 12, so good afternoon. I'm Laurence Oakes-Ash, CEO of City Science. Next slide, please. If you've not heard of us, we're a team of transport planners, researchers, data scientists and software engineers who develop tools and strategies for transport, active travel and decarbonisation. Next slide, please. In this talk, I'm going to give you a brief update on some work we've been doing as part of a project on place-based decarbonisation. First of all, we're going to talk about what's driving carbon emissions in the UK. Then I'm going to talk about what I've taken from the literature review we've conducted about how we can address those carbon issues. And finally, we're going to pull this together into what, in my personal view, is the key message that we need to take from all the evidence. Next slide, please. The first thing to say is that we're in a climate and biodiversity emergency. And I think, if you haven't watched David Attenborough's The Life on Our Planet, then I really encourage you to do so, as he articulates this far more passionately than I can on a single slide. But the net result is that our actions and activities are having significant and wide-reaching impacts on our planet, and we have a limited time window to act. Next slide, please. In terms of transport, it doesn't matter which way you look at it. If you believe that net zero by 2050 needs to be achieved or net zero by 2030, all of those options require radical change from what we've been doing in the past. To meet any of these targets, we need between 5% and 13% annual reductions in transport carbon. And the longer we leave it, the harder and faster it will need to happen. So it's not an understatement to say that this is a profound step change. Put it in context, over the last 30 years, the transport sector has achieved only a 3% reduction in carbon. So what we've been doing to date has delivered a 0.1% change per year. And what we need to be doing is a 5 to 13% change. And I don't believe that we're going to achieve that with the business as usual approach. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly talk about place-based carbon, what drives carbon in places. And there've been a number of studies to look at this. Most of them focus on total energy or total carbon, but the key kind of conclusions are urban form has a clear impact on overall carbon from different typologies of settlement. Key drivers for total carbon include density, land use, connectivity and accessibility, but other factors such as income, fuel mix, distance to services and opportunities are also important. High household incomes in lowly dense settlements, they're the most likely to have high carbon emissions, whereas more compact settlements are more likely to be more efficient. And there's also a kind of key consumption driver to the carbon emissions that we can't ignore, the carbon footprint, and that often isn't captured if we're only looking at territorial emissions. But importantly, when we looked at all the studies, there weren't many that were focused purely on transport carbon. Next slide, please. So to address this, we did a number of things. But the one I think that's useful to show you is probably actually the simplest. And this is a bottom-up estimate of commuting carbon emissions just based on census data. And it's a nice way of doing it because it means we have a measure of carbon for fine-grained geographies across the UK. And we can layer up this model with other journey purposes and freight to essentially get a disaggregation of the Bay's territorial data. And from that, we can then start to look at what kind of key predictors are within these places for the transport carbon. Next slide, please. So this next slide is simply saying the geographic factors in our predictive model. Essentially, this is a predicted carbon that's simply coming from features related to geography. And you can see that there's a fairly obvious pattern here. with that urban-rural split. If you're in the red, you're likely to be in a rural area, and that's where, for most of those middle super output areas, the model's predicting a higher transport carbon. But I just want to show you another map. So if you just click forward on the slide here. So this has exactly the same pattern. So on the right, we have car ownership in the UK. So this is actually ownership of more than 2 vehicles. So on this map, the green areas are where car ownership is high, and orange is where it's lower. And apart, obviously, from the colours, the patterns are almost identical. So what can we say about these places that have both high car ownership and higher carbon? Well, they're the ones that are also most likely to have limited access to jobs, limited access to services and leisure, and most importantly, limited alternatives to the private car. Next slide, please. To show this another way, in this chart, we've plotted the mode share of every settlement in the UK with a population greater than 5,000 people. And you can see that the majority of places sit within the pink triangle. This basically indicates that private car share in the majority of places is at least 55%, if not 65 to 70% in a denser cluster of places in that triangle there. The distribution of active travel is fairly wide, but I think what's really important to note is it's very, very rare for public transport to ever exceed 15%. Next slide, please. So far we've talked about commuting, but as I said, we can layer up the carbon model and analysis to cover a wide range of other purposes. So in this next slide, we've actually replicated an analysis done by the DfT back in 2008 using the National Travel Survey, where we're showing the relationship between trips, vehicle miles and carbon emissions for each journey purpose. So here, the inner ring's showing you the share of the trips, the middle ring's showing the share of the vehicle miles, and the outer ring's showing the share of estimated carbon emissions. So these carbon emission estimates take into account the likely mode and occupancy of that particular purpose. And what you can see from this is that commuting's just over an eighth of the trips, but a quarter of the carbon. Whereas on the other hand, education trips, they're over an eighth of the trips as well, but only 4% of the carbon. So that's all to do with the distances that we're traveling, the modes that we're using, and the occupancy of those trips. So the big one here that we rarely talk about is leisure. So leisure represents about a quarter of the personal trips we do, but over a third of the carbon. And the reason it contributes so much is because the distances travelled are often longer, and the preferred mode is also predominantly the private car. So I don't think we can think about cycling and walking interventions in isolation from a carbon perspective, because there's a lot going on that makes us travel as we do. It's as much about bringing services, jobs, leisure and green space closer to where people choose to live or can afford to live, and making sure they can get there by sustainable modes. So I'm going to stop there with charts for today. I've cut out quite a few things that I wanted to show you because of time. There's quite a lot more that we can see in the data. So if you're interested in that, do get in touch. But I wanted to move on to the next section, which is all about solutions. So knowing that there's a climate emergency and seeing this kind of brief overview of the problem, what opportunities do we have to fix it? So what we've done as part of this project is also look at over 40 interventions, collecting research, evaluations and evidence from all over the world to see what impact those interventions are likely to have. We've then used that evidence to develop pathways to an 80% reduction in carbon by 2030 for a range of places across the UK. And it is really hard. There's no denying how hard that is. Why did we choose 80% by 2030? Well, those are the science-based targets from the Tyndall Centre in Manchester University. They equate to that 13% reduction per year. So they're at the ambitious end, but an important test to help understand what's likely to be needed, to meet our own net zero targets of 2050. And we've grouped those interventions into 3 categories: avoid, shift, improve. Avoid being the interventions that can help us not make the trip or reduce the trip length. Shift being those interventions that are going to change our behaviour and get us to use different modes. And finally, improve, which essentially takes anything that's remaining and transitions it to zero carbon fuels. For avoid, it's really about how we pioneer the use of digital, how we bring services and jobs closer to where people live, this popular idea of the 15 or 20-minute neighbourhood, and how we make sure that land use is working with transport planning to get the right outcomes. But the thing that interested me the most was researching the shift category. So in this category, we have a range of interventions that would either be an enabler or a deterrent, a carrot or a stick, if you will. And I became really interested in trying to find research that had actually tried to isolate the impacts of enablers, comparing those with deterrents, because I think that's a critical question. People naturally prefer enablers, but we need to know what's working, so that we can actually plan our policies. And you can see that I've grouped that list there with the deterrents at the top and the enablers at the bottom. So through this research, I've come to the view that deterrents are really, really important. And I think we can think about this in terms of cycling and walking investment just by considering the fact that privately we spend £177 billion on transport. So that's what the British public are privately paying to move around. And let's be clear, it's mainly on the cars that are driving carbon emissions. So some of these deterrents, like congestion charges, parking levies and fuel taxes, they're not necessarily popular, but they're one of the only real mechanisms we have of capturing a greater share of that private expenditure that we could then use to invest in other things like walking and cycling. Next slide, please. But also when I started to dig into this issue, the evidence that I was finding was suggesting that deterrents are also likely to be really important in shifting behaviours. So the reviews that I found suggested that interventions aimed at enabling active travel have only modest impacts, up to 5% at best. Reviews often found that schemes were unlikely to have impacts on their own. And in many of those cycling infrastructure utopia type of case studies that people like to cite, very often those case study examples would also have quite severe restrictions on private cars, at least within the city centres. Some papers even go further, showing that deterrents can have a significant impact on stimulating the change way beyond the change that would have been achieved with enablers alone. One of the best studies that we found tried to measure this scientifically. They found that with enablers only, they got a 5% change. But when they combined enablers and deterrents, they got a 43% change. And they were doing that in a scientific manner as best they could to see that they, to try and isolate the impacts. So alongside the research, we also held a series of workshops. And the example in the UK that was cited by a lot of people was the difference between Cambridge and Milton Keynes. Next slide, please. So just to give you a flavour, these two maps show you the density of cycling infrastructure in each of those two places. Milton Keynes has 300 kilometres of cycleways, nearly all of which is segregated, but only a 4.2% mode share. Cambridge has far less infrastructure, but a 29% cycling share for residents of the city. And I think one of the workshop participants summed this up for me perfectly. They said, Milton Keynes has great infrastructure, but it's too easy to drive. Cambridge hasn't got great infrastructure, but it's horrible to drive. If our theory of change can't explain the difference between Milton Keynes and Cambridge, then I'd argue that our theory of change needs some work. And I think it's an important message. If we're going to achieve the kind of change we need to deliver net zero, we're going to need to make it harder to drive. Next slide, please. So pulling this all together, I'd summarise the issue as follows. In my view, we currently have a vicious cycle which is at the heart of why transport generates carbon and congestion. We have too many places with limited jobs, services and alternatives to the private car. As a result, the car is the primary mode of transport, but this also means that deterrents are politically sensitive. We therefore can't tap into the money that's there, the £177 billion prize. And as a result, any investment in alternatives is only ever marginal, and the cycle of car dependency continues. Next slide, please. In my view, there's only two options to break this chain. One, we go big bang on funding, provide the alternatives advance, bearing in mind that to really demonstrate an impact, we'll probably need some deterrents as well. Two, we give places the political cover and powers to capture more funding themselves so that they can then reinvest in those alternatives. Final slide, please. Faced with a climate emergency and the changes that we need and the pace that we're going to need them, we don't have any easy choices. We're not going to deliver that 5% to 13% annual reduction in carbon doing the same things we've always done. My view is that the answer is likely to lie somewhere between those two options. Greater local powers for deterrence and revenue raising with some immediate pump priming to start the ball rolling. And to finish, I've just sketched out what a virtuous circle might look like. With a political cover to implement deterrents, as soon as they're implemented, the alternatives become much more attractive. We start to capture funding and we can begin to outline a multi-year programme of investment in all of these places that need it. Then use and ridership of those alternatives is going to grow, generating more income. Places are going to become less car dependent and the opposition to deterrents will diminish. So I'll leave it there. Next slide, please. As I said, if you've got any questions on any, or you want to go into the data in any more detail, very happy for you to get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. And so we are now moving on to the question and answer session. So if you haven't typed them in, please do. I'm hoping the other panelists are going to rejoin us, because the first question is for Susan. And I believe the question is, walking hardly featured in gear change. Walking is far more accessible for groups like over 65s with the lowest levels of physical activity. How can we get a fairer share of investment in walking infrastructure?
A great question. I wish I had the answer to that. My focus is normally far more on walking than on cycling, and yes, unfortunately, gear change was far more about cycling. I always think that walking should be absolutely top of the transport hierarchy, the modal hierarchy, because it is the most accessible mode. It is the thing that we all do to a certain extent, whether I said looking at walking in its broader sense, so people in wheelchairs, people walking with sticks, etc. And I think we should always put walking first. And Living Streets, as the UK charity for everyday walking, is working hard with government to try and ensure that walking has more priority. And I hope that with the formation of Active Travel England and the commissioner, that walking will have equal footing, every pun intended, with cycling, or actually more so. And it's a constant frustration of mine that sort of the active travel agenda focuses so much on cycling. Cycling is important, but walking should always be first, and I think there should be a lot more funding and financing. And I think sadly, maybe it's just because a lot of people, or the support is not there. People almost take walking for granted. I said there aren't so many organised lobby groups out there campaigning for more walking. It isn't high enough on politicians' agenda. Cycling is represented by some very strong, very powerful and good lobby groups, and I think, you know, it's also something, it comes down to who's making the decision and who is in power. And you know, we know that cycling is a personal passion of the Prime Minister's, for example, and I would like to see politicians being more speaking more about walking and recognizing the importance of it. I think because it is so simple, it gets overlooked, but the benefits are massive and need more recognition.
Thank you, Susan. I'm sorry, I didn't say that question was from Ruth Galetti. So coming on to question 2, which I think is for Ian, and this is from Alison Ring. What are the barriers to moving from car use to e-bike use? And is it cost of e-bike or lack of infrastructure, please?
Yeah, both of the above. And it depends who you are and where you are. Yeah. So like Susan's presentation picked this sort of thing up very well. There are people who do not consider themselves potential cyclists. There are groups of people who do not consider themselves potential e-bikers. And sometimes that's got to do with location. It's an infrastructure, for example. Other times it may be connected with cost. So some of the measures to promote e-bikes may be around infrastructure and subsidizing people's purchase of them, or using rental schemes or mobility hubs, schemes in areas where people might not have access to kind of the city centre type of e-bike schemes, so more rural schemes, for example. So it just needs a variety of different approaches in different places. And also Laurence's comments about you need the carrots and the sticks. You've got to promote e-bikes, but you've also got to remove those barriers, and sometimes the sticks are part of that.
Thank you, Ian. So the next question is for Laurence, and it's from Tom, and I apologise for the pronunciation that's to follow. Bogdanovich, sorry, it's a long surname. And his question was, London Cycling Campaign's Climate Safe Streets report argues that smart road pricing is needed to secure zero carbon transport. Does the panel agree? So to Laurence to start.
Well, I mean, I think I clearly agree that funding is, I think the funding pots, if you just look at them by mode, where we've got 27 billion going into roads, you know, and we've got very limited in comparison funding going into cycling and buses. You know, I think that we've got to be realistic about what we can achieve within those funding windows, and I think we've got to get to a point where we can set out local plans that have multi-year programs of we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And I think that that's where all the people that we speak to are struggling, because they don't have the power to set out those plans, and they don't have the power really to make the shift in modes. I think that there's a lot of aspirational councils out there, a lot of people who would embrace the idea of place-based solutions, but they often don't have the powers or the funding to do the things that they want to do.
Thank you. Did anyone else from the panel want to come in on that one? Oh, Susan, yep.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we do need a system of road pricing, and it is about those disincentives. And I think what the term I tend to use is transport gluttony. And for me, a prime example of that is the increasing use of SUVs, particularly in urban areas. And I think, to make walking and cycling truly effective and accessible for everybody, we need to address the adverse impacts that come from particularly from private car use. So things like pavement parking, and I welcome the government's consultation on that about lower speeds. I think there should be a lower speed limit. It's all of these things that need to reduce the dominance of vehicle traffic, still allowing it, because there will always be a need for some people to travel by car. So I think it's recognizing, and when people are not single mode objects, people who walk also cycle, or they catch the bus, or they use the train, or they drive a car. So it's about looking at all the modes, but we certainly need to reduce the dominance of road traffic, and some of that will be through physical means or through other restrictions. But I think road pricing, and a targeted road pricing, not the sort of the blanket thing we have at the moment, will really help in terms of raising revenue and making people think twice about when they're making that journey. So is this a journey I really need to make, as opposed to, well, I've already paid for the car and I've paid for all the running costs, and it's just too easy to jump in the car and drive a mile down the road.
Thank you. And so the next one is from James Craig to Llinos. What potential exists for mounting bikes on front racks of buses on regular busy urban routes?
Oh, that's a good question. I think in terms of kind of bikes and buses, there are numerous transport modes that exist around the world that integrate bicycle carry and bikes, whether that's kind of on the bus, or kind of with a trailer behind a bus, or just in a bike rack on the front of a bus. So for example, kind of British Columbia, a lot of the buses there, they have 2 or 3, they have space on the front of the bus for 2 or 3 bikes. And that seems to work pretty well over there. So I think there is potential, but I think the way that the kind of public transport is like funded in sort of the UK at the moment, it's unlikely that we're going to see that happening unless there kind of is a push from kind of policy makers.
Thank you. And so the next question is from Julie Milton to Susan. Bike hangers secure on-street parking for bikes outside people's homes seems to get overlooked as part of cycling infrastructure. But if you live in the kind of housing where you can't store a bike, then you can't have a bike. What should be done about getting bike hangers on a widespread basis?
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and that's one of the recommendations in our report was about the availability and cost of cycle parking, but also making sure that cycle parking is suitable for electric cycles, or for adapted cycles, or for cargo bikes. And I think we need to work more with local authorities, that they should be removing car parking spaces to provide more bike hangers. And we are seeing this. I mean, Hackney's been one of the leaders. I think Hackney has cycle hangers on virtually every street. My own borough, which is Islington, which is very good for some things in terms of transport, not so good for others. And it's in Islington, you've got the situation, if you have a pure battery electric vehicle or a low emission vehicle, you can park that vehicle for free or for a relatively low cost with a residence permit. But if you are a resident with a cycle and you want to use the cycle hangers, you have to pay over £100 a year for that parking. And I think that is absolutely sending out the wrong message. And I think too many local authorities in looking to how they can achieve net zero have automatically gone down that means electric vehicles. And electric cars specifically, and we see that in the way that electric vehicle charging posts are often put in the footway. And I think there really needs to be this shift that actually achieving net zero is not just about electrifying the fleet, it is about encouraging walking first and cycling, and recognizing that, yeah, many people do not have spaces to actually park a cycle or bring a cycle inside. So we need better public hangars, we need them at lower cost. And I think, yeah, there should be one, certainly in the city areas, there should be one on every street. And I said we need to look at how we can reduce the cost. And I said that should be higher priority, I think, than providing car parking places.
Thank you. And so the next, oh, Ian, did you want to come in on that? I think you're on mute, Ian.
Those kind of arguments also carry across. No, I'm not muting at the moment. Can you hear me? Sound quality might be a bit poor. Yeah, yeah. This kind of thing also applies in more rural areas and new suburban housing developments where bike hangars might be able to help people not own multiple cars, and it frees up car park. It reduces the amount of car parking space on a residential development, for example.
Thank you. And so the next question is to Llinos from Roy White. Do we have stats on how many try cycling to work or the shops, etc., but then stop, and why they stop, and how we could prevent this?
So this is something that we're actually looking at in the various waves of the survey that we have looked at. So the survey that we've done, we ask people about all aspects of their lifestyle during COVID, including shopping, how they maybe take their children to school, what that sort of commute looks like, how they commute themselves, and the different journeys that people take. I don't have the stats to hand at the moment, but I can say that the next round of survey, we're definitely, one of the things that we're looking at into more detail is how in terms of the kind of what journeys are people making by bike, and how have these changed, and what do they intend to do as sort of restrictions ease. And then with the idea that in the third wave of survey we can go back to the same people and kind of ask if this has changed you know, in the future. We did see from the survey data that there is an intention in some locations in the UK to I think it was Liverpool and Edinburgh to actually use bikes as a way to kind of get children to school, more so than what they did before the lockdown. But we're still trying to work out whether that's actually translated into actual kind of behaviour and sort of in rather than intention.
Thank you. And so the next question is to Ian, but Llinos, I think you might want to come back in on it as well. It's from Thomas Knight, and it is, have you considered using Strava Metro data, which is free to access, to explore before and after impacts on streets? The data goes back to 2017.
I haven't used it, but I know it's available. So yeah, that is something that we could look at in the future. I've also recently run a survey in the Lake District specifically about e-bike use during 2020, and yeah, I've got some results, but I haven't counted them all properly, so I'm a bit you know, cautious about saying what the result is too early. But there's some indication from those surveys that people in the Lake District were using e-bikes to make their lives easier during lockdown 1. They were using their e-bikes more than they were before lockdown, and as yet we've got to look at the data a bit more to see if that's kept up or not.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add, Claris?
Yeah, just a comment really about Strava. We're not sort of using that data in our work just because of resources and kind of time to kind of analyze all the data that we've got and actually get some useful things to come out of this COVID research. But it's important to remember that when we look at kind of Strava, you kind of need to consider who are the people that are using Strava. And this goes back to kind of what I can see Susan nodding there about this whole branding of kind of a cyclist. And Strava is very much associated with maybe a cyclist, you know, and that view that people have of a cyclist, and the people who use Strava maybe a cyclist rather than people that we want to kind of use bikes as a mode of transport for all their different journeys. And in terms of kind of the different journeys that people take, in terms of the people that are using Strava, they'd often use Strava for the sort of leisure activities that they're doing and the cycle rides that they go on, rather than maybe the journeys that they take to the shops or kind of these other journeys that we're looking at trying to change the modes of transport away from kind of using the car.
Thank you. And so the next question is going to Laurence from Thomas McPhail. Can I ask about age cohorts and cycling amongst the over 65 population? Is it possible to introduce policies specifically aimed at the over 65s?
So I think there's probably something important to say about e-bikes before I come to that. So there's a recent paper, which is basically from September 2020, which essentially asks the question, do people who buy e-bikes cycle more? And in the cohort that they were basically modelling, or they were actually monitoring, I mean, they saw that the people who purchased an e-bike increased their use from 2.1 kilometres to 9.2 kilometres a day. And essentially the e-bike then became up to from 17% to 49% share in terms of the travel they were using. Right? So there's now evidence of the extent to which e-bikes can make a real difference, once they're being deployed. And I think that e-bikes also offer a huge potential, because I don't think we can necessarily just see an e-bike as a bike, and I think we see this with sort of the diversity of the biking, the types of bikes that Susan set out. I think once you've got bikes with tricycles, you've got an axle, you've got more space to put things on. And I think if we kind of expand our view of what a bike is, then actually we're essentially talking about a vehicle which essentially could answer the missing middle for a lot of people, making it easier for them to use, solving some of the challenges that I know that people have. Obviously, risk in terms of cycling is a big challenge, but when you kind of dig below risk, then other challenges that people talk about are getting the kids to school, transporting stuff. These are all things where you could have a very, very lightweight, flexible vehicle based on an electric drivetrain that we could essentially set out, and there's this huge opportunity economically there to actually be the leader in those sorts of technologies. So that I think could solve the issues of all of the issues that people have with cycling, and potentially make vehicles more attractive to older generation as well.
Thank you. And so the next question is coming to Susan from James Brown. And James was interested in the comments by Dr. Brown about security being a barrier to cycling, with retailers showing reluctance to register bikes and e-bikes on a national database. Can the government help encourage retailers to take action which would help reduce the significant problem of cycle theft and help police identify stolen bikes?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it comes down to what's provided in terms of planning when a development is first provided, and it's pleasing to see that there is more demand now for cycle parking to be provided. But I said it's recognising that we've got the legacy of the built environment, much of which was developed in over the years when cycling parking was not required. And I think all too often you see supermarkets, the cycle parking is stuck in a corner that can't be used for car parking space. So it's not proper good cycle parking. It's just a bit of redundant space. It's what do we do with it? Oh well, we'll stick a Sheffield stand in and consider that done, sort of thing. So I think that there needs to be more done to provide secure parking in attractive places that are overlooked. And again, I said with a variety of parking, so it does suit all sorts of bikes. We're seeing more people going to the supermarket now with a trailer and getting their shopping done in that way. So I think it does need to be improved. I think the retailers need to do more. The big problem is that retailers in general still associate car drivers with wealth, and we see this particularly with walking. So if you talk to retailers about how they think their shoppers arrive, they think most of them drive, and the ones that drive have the money, whereas there is good research by Living Streets and others that show that particularly people walking, spend more in town centres than people who drive there. So it is about providing cycle parking, but it's about providing other things that make for a quality sort of human environment. And that includes things like benches, it includes public toilets. It's all about creating places where people want to stay. And one of the best ways of doing that will be by reducing parking, but that's still a difficult argument to get across through retailers. So it's good to see that prominence is being given to that in publications like Gear Change, in the LTN 120, which came out earlier in the year on cycling. Manual for Streets is to be revised next year. And I think it's really important that we think about all modes and all environments, and it's about thinking about how people move around, about what people need. So I said it's toilets, it's drinking fountains, it's nice places, it's attractive places, it's planting, which also helps in terms of achieving net zero and emissions sort of thing. So it's looking at it in a complete way. But I think, you know, one of the key things with the example of retailers is they need to know more about how their shoppers travel there, and maybe that's down to all of us to actually express what we want to happen as well. I've actually found that sort of could be called haranguing, but you know, communicating with retailers via Twitter and other things about what we want can be a powerful way to get things done. So I think it's a question of people saying what they want as well.
Thank you. And so the next one's coming to you as well, Susan, but please, if anyone else wants to answer, where do you think that cycle training fits in the package of measures to overcome the barriers to cycling, especially from an inclusive perspective? And that's from Patrick Jarman.
Thank you. Yeah, I think cycle training is really important, and it is part of the package of measures. It's a sort of thing that at the moment I think is often seen as something that's purely for children. You know, the national cycling proficiency test that many of us did many years ago, and it's sort of assumed that once you've done that, then you know you can ride a bike and you never forget, and it's all fine. But I think a lot of the cycle training is about giving people confidence that they know how to ride a bike, that they know what to do if they get a puncture. But I think you know, cycle training by itself is really important, but it is not enough, and there needs to be equally the driver training. And so people, you know, I think many motorists, they don't willfully go past cyclists close by. They just don't realize what it feels like if you're on a cycle and a car goes by very close to you. It's a very unpleasant experience, and people don't realize that. And there are some good training programs now, particularly with freight drivers, with lorry drivers, and with bus operators, actually getting them to be on a bike and know what it is like. So I think it cycle training, yes, but actually we need training for all road users to actually have more appreciation for what it is like from a different road user's perspective.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to come in on that one? Okay, so the next one, again, Susan, I think you're in the hot seat again. This one is from Vivian from Cycle Hoop here. An interesting stat in response to Susan Claris's presentation. I believe women make up 27% of London cyclists. Comparatively, 48% of our bike hanger members are female. This clearly shows the incredible impact accessible and safe cycling parking has on enabling inclusive cycling. Do you have anything to add?
I think that's more of a comment, and it's interesting to hear rather than a question. But yes, I think it is. You know, the data I presented was national data, and I think we do see very different patterns of cycling across the nation. And I said at the moment it is far more of a, you know, seen as far more of a city thing. But yeah, I mean, I think things like the Santander cycle hire is used about 70% by men and less by women. So if anything we can do to actually make cycling more attractive, I think is really important. So no, that's a helpful comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next one is coming to Laurence. Adaptive cycles are on average substantially more expensive than standard cycles, to the extent that many disabled people cannot afford a cycle, even if they'd like to start cycling. Very few hire schemes offer adaptive cycles. Do any of the panelists have any ideas or suggestions on how to reduce this fundamental barrier to cycling, please?
So, I mean, I think part of this is all around how we get money into the things that we're going to need in order to decarbonise and make it accessible to everyone. And I think that we've got to be in a position where we can help people get the cycles that they need. And I think this is for vulnerable people, for the elderly, but also, you know, I think we've got some great potential examples of schemes we could do to get people onto e-bikes. You know, so I think that it is within our gift to essentially come up with the schemes to redeploy money which is currently, you know, being spent. As I said, there's 177 billion pounds that we're spending privately on moving around. It is within our gift to deploy some of that money doing the things that actually make it more sustainable.
Oh, did I see a hand there, Ian?
Yeah, I might say what Susan was about to say. I think a little bit of it is in terms of making decisions about how you provide this, yeah, ask people from those communities who need those different types of bikes. Don't rely purely on me, a middle-aged white man who wears lycra to cycle sometimes. You've got to ask the people from the communities that need something that's not a traditional bicycle.
And Susan?
Yeah, if I can just add to that. So one of the recommendations in our Cycling for Everyone report is that the mobility allowance that people with disabilities are entitled to and can be used by Motability to purchase a vehicle or to purchase a mobility scooter. At the moment, you cannot use that to purchase an adapted cycle. And that was one of our specific recommendations, that that should be altered to make the purchase of an adapted cycle more feasible for someone who has a disability.
And Llinos?
I think kind of agree with what everyone said so far. But when we're having sort of conversations with different groups about what their needs are, we also kind of need to if these people don't already have bikes, then they might not be aware about security issues. They might not be aware of storage issues. They might not be aware of all these other things associated with that can make the cycling experience a much more pleasant experience, such as like mudguards and things like that. So it kind of links with what Susan and some of the other questions before were about, like training, and how training is not necessarily about how you maybe navigate a road, but it can be about all these other things that are involved with cycling, like maintenance. And like the last thing you want anyone the last thing you want to happen to anybody is that they, you know, save up, or it's a big deal to try and get a bike, and then they use it for a week, and then unfortunately it's stolen. So there needs to be these questions about sort of security and storage and the whole sort of package, really, not just about purchasing a cycle.
Thank you. And this one, next one's coming to you as well. And this one's a similar topic. One barrier to cycling is that you need planning permission to put a bike shed in your front garden. And this can add £250 to the cost. And so there's also then a follow-up question for Ruth in there and myself as to whether or not the All-Party Parliamentary Cycling Group could look into changing the Town and Country Planning GPDO 1995 to accept cycle stores from this requirement. And that's from Martin Gorst. So Llinos, did you have anything to add to that or thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, it's definitely something that needs to change. It should be easier for people to kind of have cycle storage. Kind of the way that we approach kind of bikes, for example, when they get stolen, it's kind of a bit disjointed at the moment. A bike gets stolen and there is no national database. Regional local police forces don't speak to each other, and criminals unfortunately know this. They know that they can take a bike from one area to another area and sell it on the internet, and that if they get caught by that police force, it's not gonna be traced back. So if a car gets stolen, there seems to be a lot more sort of importance on it. When a bike gets stolen, it's not the same importance level there. And we kind of need to remember that again, which if we're trying to encourage people to cycle more who aren't kind of cyclists, having a bike that's stolen is going to kind of put them off and be a massive barrier then to kind of getting these people to kind of cycle a bit more again.
Thank you. And I'm going to apologise now because I think my questioning system that's been working well in the background may have gone slightly awry. And so this next question is from Jennifer Evans. I'm not 100% certain who it's to, but please, you can all dive in. The government's funding for tranche 2 of the emergency active travel funding is still only indicative and has not yet been given to local or combined authorities. Have we missed the opportunity to change behaviour which COVID-19 lockdown provided? Laurence.
So I think that we've seen from the presentations that the impacts of COVID have been profound, right? And my personal experience of it, I've been married to my wife for 10 years. She's never cycled, and she cycled every day during COVID. So it did make some significant differences. I think the key thing that was different in COVID for me was the absence of traffic, you know, and I think that that's the key thing that enabled people to try it for the first time. And as soon as traffic's come back, obviously we've got these seasonal issues in here as well. So in terms of the data, the seasonality is a problem in that data. But as soon as the traffic came back, you know, people stopped doing the things that they were doing during COVID. So I think that this is where deterrents are key. And I think that we also need this multi-year program of making these changes. It can't just be, you know, an emergency issue. You know, the emergency we have is the fact that we've got this climate emergency. We've got to tackle it. So we do need to be able to spell out a multi-year program of permanent measures that are going to improve cycling, of which I think deterring car travel has to be part.
Sorry, did anyone else want to come back in on that one? Clear.
I think it's important to think about in terms of the infrastructure that's happened is to maybe take the point that I made in the presentation that maybe this is the end of the beginning. It doesn't mean that the opportunity's not there anymore. It's the case that we're moving on to a new phase of kind of opportunity and what that is now. And I think it is a case of moving some of the conversations away from, you know, these headlines of, you know, we've got this much money and we're kind of plowing it into all of this infrastructure, and kind of moving those conversations now onto kind of the necessity for active travel and the kind of health and sort of well-being and the need for kind of more active travel, rather than kind of like the infrastructure that's just kind of been put in place.
Thank you. And Susan?
Yeah, I mean, we had a definite window of opportunity during the summer, and that has reduced because of increasing car traffic now. But I think for me, one of the things that's come out very strongly is the increased traffic down residential roads that has, you know, the way that traffic on main roads, this is over the last 10 years, has sort of stabilized or in some places reduced, but there's evidence to show that traffic on residential streets has almost doubled. And that seems primarily due to people using wayfinding apps which divert traffic down residential streets. So I think there's a really strong opportunity now to introduce more low traffic neighborhoods, people friendly streets, whatever name you want to give them, in these residential streets. So it's not necessarily about providing, you know, walking and cycling separate facilities. Is actually looking at streets as being places for people and for local movements, and getting rid of that through traffic, but also reducing the really short amount of journeys. And I said, see this all over in London. You know, once you get these low traffic neighbourhoods, the whole nature of a street changes. And I think that will be really fundamental in encouraging more people to walk and cycle, because they see other people doing it. It becomes a pleasurable activity. I know there's been quite a strong anti-movement in some places for low traffic neighbourhoods, and you know, we've seen schemes being vandalised and all sorts of abhorrent behaviour. I think politicians need to be brave and need to, you know, ride that wave of discontent, because we know it will happen, but recognise that actually it will end up with better streets for everybody, that will be healthier streets, nicer places for everyone to be.
Thank you. And so the next one's for Ian from Alan Nettleton. Do you have any views on how to embrace e-scooters and other devices within cycle infrastructure?
I've not got a huge amount of experience with e-scooters. The information that I've seen from other people's research is that e-scooters tend to be used for very short journeys, and there's discussion about whether those journeys are simply replacing journeys that could be made by walking and cycling, or whether they are part of a multimodal journey. So advocates are saying that if you can use a scooter for the last mile of your journey, then you might take a train and then a scooter, and maybe walk a little bit at the beginning of your journey, as opposed to using a car. And I think there's various studies, some very much advocating that this is great, and others saying that actually they add very little objectively to mode shift away from cars, but these are studies from different places. There's a few other people have argued that they are potentially fun and enjoyable and not using a car, so there could be something well-being related. There's also an emerging amount of safety research looking at whether e-scooters are particularly safe, particularly whether there's some dangers of using them when it's wet, when there's slippery things on the roads, things like that. So I don't have a lot of first-hand experience, but I know that there's a lot of there's a lot of research activity trying to get a handle on what their actual carbon reduction purpose could be, and the jury's out at the moment.
Thank you for that, Ian. Oh, Laurence, did you want to come in?
Yeah, if that's okay. Yeah, so to echo what Ian said there, I mean, the studies, so the London Cycling Campaign, or from some American studies, has essentially shown that they can shift modes away from private vehicles, but also shift modes away from walking and potentially lower extent public transport and cycling. I guess the key challenge is that we have this competition for road space. You know, we have competition from, you know, segregated cycling infrastructure. Potentially, if we've got e-bikes, we may need some new infrastructure that sort of is even more joined up than the current cycling infrastructure that we've got. And we don't want to have too many of these modes mixing at higher speeds. You know, in particular, kind of pedestrians and cyclists. So I think there is a real challenge there once we start throwing more and more things in the mix. I think the best opportunity is the lanes of traffic, but currently for private cars, with dedicated lanes for e-bikes and e-scooters together. And I think we can statistically say which ones are going to be the best ones to do. So we did some work in 2017 where we looked at first and last mile opportunities around integration with public transport, and found that where we could do it right, and this was actually with autonomous vehicle shuttles, but there was a potential to take about 48% of the cars off the road. You know, so there is potential, but we've got to be bold about what road space we're reallocating and making sure we've got safety between the different interactions that are going to result.
Lovely, thank you. So we've only got just over 5 minutes left. So if we can go for some snappy answers, so we've got a lot more questions in the box to get through. So the next one I think is for Susan. As local authorities are so key in influencing the availability of active travel infrastructure, what are the key things they are still missing in terms of knowledge or data to enable the right decision making, please?
Okay, so I mean, I think they need to focus more, I said, on being brave in terms of reducing the amount of parking, which will be both on street and off street, and devoting more street space to parklets, to cycle hangers, to all the things that we've been mentioning. I think at the moment, sort of politicians, local politicians, you know, they respond very much to what their constituents are asking for and are lobbying for, and that tends to be, if you talk to most council members, it's potholes and parking. Those are their major concerns from constituents, and I think we need to make the walking voice, the cycling voice, the people voice more strongly felt, so politicians are actually responding to that as opposed to the irate of Tunbridge Wells minority.
Thank you very much. Apologies for the background noise. I have a small puppy destroying a bottle under my feet. He's destroyed most of the house during the call. So this next one is from Roger Gethin, and he says he doesn't know how many parliamentarians are on the call, Ruth, so maybe we can take this away, but it'd be really useful to discuss the immediate political opportunities to act on the evidence we've just been hearing, and how the APPG can influence the transport decarbonisation plan and spending review to shift transport spending towards walking, cycling and other healthy and low carbon transport, and to the planning white paper to ensure that resulting developments are located and designed to support cycling and walking. So Ruth and I, I'm sure, can take that away. So the next one then is for Susan. That was from Roger Gethin. This next one's from Robert Davis. With all this positivity and amount of funding being given towards active travel, did you know that all funding for Legible London, UK's largest wayfinding scheme, has been frozen since March, with the likelihood of no funding till the next financial year? Wayfinding is key to promoting walking and cycling as primary travel source, boosting local economy by increasing footfall and trade, and reduces air pollution. Why is there a lack of investment in permanent infrastructure in terms of physical wayfinding, which has been proven to aid walking and cycling?
I agree about the importance of wayfinding. Why the funding has been frozen, I can't comment on, but I think it's really important to recognise that information is key in terms of influencing people's travel behaviour. And I think along with the physical wayfinding, like the Legible London, I think travel apps are really good at particularly in terms of walking. So apps like City Mapper that give you choice, that tell you how far a journey is, then how long it will take to walk, and how long it will take to drive. And I hope those apps will be developed more in future to include other things in terms of what streets have the best air quality. So I think we need to focus more on things that things that influence people's behaviour rather than just focusing so much on the infrastructure side, because people need to be informed. If you tend to talk to motorists, they think, oh, it's only 5 minutes in the car, it's only 10 minutes in the car, and they think it will take an hour to drive, whereas actually the driving element is probably a lot longer than that. And if you take into account the parking and everything else, so people have people don't make their decisions on perfect information. So I think I agree, more wayfinding, but also, you know, I love City Mapper. It governs most of my transport decisions, but you go outside London, you don't have that same level of information. So I think a national wayfinding app would be really helpful.
Thank you, and hopefully we're going to get 2 more in. This one is for Llinos. And where do you think cycle training fits in the package of measures to overcome barriers to cycling, especially from an inclusive perspective? And that's from Patrick Jarman.
I'm not sure if Susan will probably have some good things to say about this as well, but I think in terms of training needs to fit in with a package of other aspects to get people cycling a bit more, but I think training is definitely up there as being quite high, but the way that we brand and promote training, like simply calling it training, again implies that, you know, you're getting taught how to learn a bike, and we all know kind of, you know, once you learn to bike, you know, arguably you know how to cycle, sort of thing. So the branding of training and the promotion of what it offers, I think it will be really important to consider in the future.
Thank you. And then the final one from Roy White, which I think is for Laurence, is can you make it harder or more expensive to drive into and park in town centres without shoppers going to out of town centres instead?
So I think that you can, and I think that when you design parking prices, you can actually do it. So what we try to do is we try to make sure that it's kind of outcome based, and if you understand sort of the flows, the pinch points of congestion, and you understand where you want people to kind of go, you can essentially design parking prices to try and channel people to make choices such that they walk past more shops. You know, so I think you can do that with good parking tariff design.
Thank you, and I'm going to hand over to Ruth to summarise this excellent session. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Selaine, for very competent chairing, and thank you to the speakers and also to Juliana and Adam and everyone who's been involved with organising today. I think it's been a really excellent session. There's some clear jobs for us as a cross-party group of parliamentarians in both houses that I've picked up on around planning regulations for cycle parking in front gardens, and also that actually goes a lot wider to automatic and high quality cycle parking being made available as part of planning policy in all new developments and all refurbishments as well. There's issues around mobility grants for cycles. There's issues that we need to push on the police and joining up the police around bike thefts, and we also need to chase it, by the sounds of it, if I pick that up right, we need to actually chase that the local authorities are getting the emergency funding they were promised. So, and there may have been others, but there's some clear tasks for us. Okay, Adam? Can I just thank the speakers, because you are academics, but you've given us the background material that helps politicians to make the decisions, and ultimately it's politicians who make the initial decisions around cycling infrastructure and spending on cycle training, etc., etc. And it's politicians who have to hold their nerve when things get difficult. And I first of all want to give a shout out to 2 sets of politicians. Somebody who, as a Labour MP, I hardly ever do, which is Boris Johnson. For I think he is responsible for leading the decisions on the emergency funding and emergency regulations during the pandemic, and also as an example of a council leadership in my own borough in Hounslow, somebody who's not a cyclist is the leader, Steve Curran, and somebody who wasn't a cyclist but now is Councillor Hanif Khan, the cabinet member for traffic and transport. And he, you know, as I have said this to him, is a middle-aged Asian, a British Asian who generally drives a very nice car. For him to become very pro cycling from experience, I think is a really good story. And you know, we do need to you know, find out these people and celebrate them, because they're going to have to hold their nerve. Because as we are seeing, if you follow my Twitter feed, in places like Chiswick, you know, their whole lives, well, for those who are getting on the social media, you would think that the whole of Chiswick is a disaster area permanently forevermore because of the traffic jams that have been caused recently, partly this week because people are desperately trying to get out and about before lockdown starts today. Permanent segregated cycleways funded by TfL is being built at the moment. So we've got temporary lights. We've got a waterworks, Thames Water closing off a key road, and we've got some low traffic neighbourhoods. But you know, there's a whole range of reasons for this, and the Queen got stuck in the traffic yesterday as well. But you know, Hounslow, I believe, are going to hold their nerve, and I'm supporting them in this. Let the schemes bed in, then have a look and see whether they need to be retained, amended, or removed. So if anybody I don't know how many local government people there are, or fellow MPs and members of the House of Lords are on, but you know, I would say do hold your nerve to let these things bed in. And for everybody else who's involved with cycling and walking, please look out for the negatives, and because I genuinely feel, having had a long experience in local government, 25 years of implementing road closures and residence parking schemes, once they get in, the noise calms down and almost everybody realizes they were put in for the right reason and they like them. But you just have to get through that initial phase, and I think that's really important at the moment. There are some things we can deal with, improving safety, absolutely essential, investing the money in both training and safe schemes. There are some negatives that, you know, oh, we can't do that, because I was in a meeting with business leaders nationally, various sector leads around business, saying, oh, it costs too much for us as employers to put in showers. Now, when I cycle all the way from Brentford to here in Westminster, I cycle 9 miles. I don't usually break sweat. I don't usually feel I need a shower at the end of it. So people don't have showers when they cycle afterward. They cycle in the Netherlands and most European cities. So I think, you know, we do need to get over some of the perceived but non-real barriers. There are some real issues around conflict, perceived, and sometimes there are, you know, there's always incidents where there's conflict between pedestrians and cyclists, or rather cyclists not respecting red lights and so on. You know, we've got some work to do there, but of course we have some very, very bad drivers. And I wonder sometimes whether the worst drivers are also the worst cyclists in terms of consideration of other road users. And there's this, again, going back to holding the nerve, there's this perception that creating safe segregated cycleways it either takes space from pedestrians. Well, that's not happening now because of COVID space is needed on footways, but seeing it being taken away from road space. And we do need to, you know, it's going to take time, and people need to see that travel patterns shift and people make their own personal choices differently. As I am, I do not describe myself as a cyclist. I own a car, but my family, we all make choices for the moment about which method to use for which journey, because we are fortunate enough to be able to have choices. But I'm increasingly using my bike to cycle around my constituency in outer West London, because frankly, it's almost always quicker than the car. That's before COVID, before the pandemic, and certainly recently as traffic started to build up again. And but you need to you need to find ways to let people make that journey. And again, revenue funding for cycle buddy schemes, cycle training, whatever you call it, to encourage people to try out. And when they try it out, they realise that actually it's not quite as scary as they first thought, or it is actually quicker than I imagined, and that sort of thing. I think I've probably run out of time, and there's some brilliant points been made, and we've got some work to do as the APPG, as parliamentarians, doing our bit to ensure to support the government in helping making it easier for more people to cycle and walk. Thank you very much, Selaine.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. It's been a fascinating session, and I think the fact we've overrun and so many people are still with us is an indication of how important this is. And so I look forward to welcoming you back to the next session, and please do stay in touch with Ruth and myself, who will go away and do some work behind the scenes. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Landor and City Science for making it possible today.
Thank you. Bye.